Okay, it's 11 a.m., so we'll go ahead and get started. Good morning, everyone. My name is Alex Arndt, and I am the Director of Online Services and Corporate Planning for the Association of Registered Nurses of BC. I am also a member of the integration team working on the Nurses and Nurse Practitioners project, Nurses and Nurse Practitioners of BC project that we'll talk about today. I see several people continuing to join the webinar, but we'll kind of just sort of proceed through this, and then we'll talk a bit at the end and take some questions. I want to start this process by just acknowledging that we are holding this webinar on the traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh Nations. I also just want to say that just by way of function and a little bit of apology, there is some construction noise going on. So if you hear beeping trucks and things like that, my apologies. If audio becomes difficult, you can just type a question. You'll see you have a long panel on the right side of your screen, and there's a question option there. If audio becomes difficult, I'll do my best to speak loudly, but we do have a bit of construction noise. So apologies for that. And as said, we've set an hour for this webinar. My intention is to not take the whole time having you listen to me through this medium, but to really go through this process and then to be able to take your questions. And if we wrap before the hour, that's obviously just fine. I just want to be sure to leave some time to make sure that we've got ample opportunity to answer your questions. The other thing to please note is that all of these webinars are recorded, and we do post them on the NNPBC.com website under past consultations and on the videos page. So if you have to leave or you'd like to share it or would like to direct anyone to it, they will be posted. There's some previous ones posted now, but this one should be posted in the next few hours or so. So just to keep that in mind. Okay, and welcome. So, apologies, just having a little computer difficulty. Okay, so, and I also apologize, I'm in here alone, so I'm driving and talking, so give me a second to just sort of move things along as my brain catches up. So we'd just like to start with this slide because, you know, what we're talking about here today, Nurses and Nurse Practitioners of BC, it represents a significant change in nursing policy in British Columbia. And we know that change is never easy, change is hard, and it can be wrought with concern and difficulty, and we certainly respect that. From the point of view of those that are on the board of the BCCNA, which we'll talk about in a second, who are moving this work forward, you know, they've wrestled this idea of an NNPBC for a long time, and there's a strong degree of confidence that bringing nursing forward with a collaborative and unified voice is the right way to go. And we are in the midst of a consultation process, as many of you, I think, are aware. And that is the intention of this, is to hear what you have to say, to take in those comments, and to be sure that the members of the board of directors of BCCNA hear the comments and can take those in as they continue to move this work forward. Okay, so just a little bit of background. We always like to sort of give a little bit of context around the three pillars of nursing. I'm sure that all of you on the call are quite well aware of this, but just to provide a little bit of context, there are three bodies in the province of British Columbia that represent nursing as it is. You've got your regulatory colleges, a professional association, and then the union. And each one performs very distinct roles. And we certainly have heard and understand that it can be a little bit confusing to get a sense of who does what, because of course there are areas for overlap. You can see that our diagram here does indicate some overlap areas. So just by way of some quick discussion, when we talk about the colleges, what we talk about in terms of the colleges is their role, and that is to protect the public. Their mandate is clear, it's simple. They protect the public, they make sure nurses are safe to practice. A professional association works on advocating on behalf of the profession. A profession doesn't advance itself, and an association can really advance the profession looking at the lenses of legislation, education, and policy. So we deal much more in the nursing arena, and when we talk about the work that the union does, the very good work that the union does with respect to workplace rights, we think about that kind of more in the context of what the union can do for nurses, much more on an individual nurse level. They work very hard in that arena. To give you, I'm hoping maybe a couple of examples will help, and again, not to belabor this, but to just go over it a little bit more. So when we talk about, for example, if there's a complaint about practice, the regulator's role in that case would be to go over what happened, ensure there are mitigations, look at the complaint, and come up with a resolution for it. So the regulator really looks at it from a functional point of view. What's happened? How might we ensure the nurse has appropriate retraining, et cetera, et cetera. That's really the way the regulator looks at it, because again, their lens is looking at this from a point of view of public protection. The union will sort of sit with the nurse and walk the nurse through this particular complaint. They may provide you with a lawyer, someone to help. They may provide additional training, but their role is to really ensure that the nurse is supported in the event of a practice complaint. And from an association perspective, if it's related to the individual, we may not actually touch it. It's when and if the issue comes up consistently and constantly. So if we hear from the college that, they're having a particular issue over and over and over again in a particular location, it's become a systemic issue that in turn the association would then need to look at from that broad systems level perspective. Another example, just briefly, again, when we talk about government. So in the case of, say, for example, RN prescribing, ARNBC would push and lobby for the change to legislation to allow for this, arguing that it's in scope and that that this is an appropriate part of RN work. The government would then go to CRNBC. So if the government enacts the legislation, CRNBC would then have to look at it from the perspective of the standards, limits, and conditions around this, and what they would need to do to ensure that the appropriate public protection angle is applied to the new legislation. And the union may look at something like that and say, okay, so now we have an increased scope. Do we need to look at increased pay for nurses performing this particular role? Okay, so just a bit on the history piece. So I'd like to give a little bit of history, and I'll go through these relatively quickly. So in the beginning, this was, I guess 2013 or so, a group of nurse leaders came together primarily centered around a key issue focused on nurse practitioners. And there was a lot of discussion in 2013 that, maybe NPs weren't so necessary. Maybe government, didn't really need to continue to support NP programming, et cetera, et cetera. And a group of nurse leaders, RNs and NPs at that time, came together and were, understandably concerned about this. The idea was that physician assistants could take on the role of the nurse practitioner. And this group of nurse leaders, RNs and NPs at that time, came together to discuss this because it was obviously an issue impacting the profession. And it didn't take long in that first meeting for it to become really clear that, even though the issue was focused on NPs, that it wasn't simply a nurse practitioner issue, it was a nursing issue. And at the end of the day, there needed to be more discussion, more collaboration about nursing issues. So this group began to meet, and very quickly, after meeting together as RNs and NPs, LPNs, RPNs were included in the fold because, again, the discussion was very clear. If you're going to talk about nursing in the province of British Columbia, we have to have everyone. We have to include everyone, and everyone needs to be part of the discussion. Various events sort of occurred around this particular move to the BC Coalition of Nursing Professionals, was sort of its initial name in 2014. Having day at the legislature, providing an opportunity to meet with government from a unified nursing perspective. And it really sort of set the stage from this unification perspective to really be thinking about formalizing and moving this BC Coalition of Nursing Associations forward. So around about 2015, the group really began to formalize quite a bit more. In January of 2015, the group was approached and asked about one college. It was, I believe, brought up by the minister at one of the days at the legislature, and the group supported the idea of one college. In April of 2015, there was a concerted effort to put forward a nursing response to the nursing regulations that came out, and in July of that year, a policy forum as well was held. At this point as well, so I've talked about, we've got this group now that represents all of the nursing designations together in this BC Coalition. But it was round about this time that it became imperative to start including the Nursing Education Council of BC. They're also called NECBC. And at this point, so we had all of the nursing designations and the nurse educators at the table on a regular basis. And in 2016, again, the BCCNA continued its work, formalizing meetings with ministry, having meetings with the chief nursing officers, ministry staff, becoming a society under the BC Societies Act, signing an MOU, and putting forward a concerted nursing response, in particular to the opioid crisis. And terms of reference, so we like to talk a little bit about terms of reference for the BC Coalition of Nursing Associations, because you can see on the screen you're looking at 3 reps, 3 reps, 3 reps, 3 reps. And the point of this was that it was necessary and important, and in fact imperative, to ensure that each of the bodies represented at this coalition table were represented equally. It's really been a foundational tenet of this group from the beginning that it had to become an enormous part of the strategy and the plan to sit equally. And it may be 400, 500 nurse practitioners in the province and 40,000 registered nurses. The numbers are the same. And it was specific and intentional, as I mentioned, ensuring that each of the voices are equal and that no one profession was left behind or felt excluded, because there have been so many opportunities in the past wherein you may have groups feeling a little bit marginalized, a little bit outside of the whole fold of nursing. And the reality is what the BCCNA has done has said, bring forward equal numbers, equal voice at the table, and the opportunity to have equal collaboration. And one of the things that's really been sort of beautiful about this model is I've had the privilege of sitting and listening to the BCCNA board, is that the discussions that occur, they occur with the utmost of respect and with the utmost of recognition of commonality on a variety of issues. So when we talk about this group meeting and talking about nursing issues, it became really clear really early, as I'd mentioned with the NP issue at the beginning, that very few issues impact a designation specifically. They impact nursing as a whole. So having everyone there, equal voice, equal representation, extremely part of this whole process for the BCCNA. So in a nutshell, that brings us to today. And as noted, today is where we're in the consultation process around NNPBC. We've talked to quite a few nurses. It's been our privilege as a team to be able to speak with nearly 2,000 nurses to date, and we continue to learn and hear from each and every single nurse that we've spoken with about their perspectives and thoughts on this single nursing association, NNPBC. So what we know right now is that, and you can see the items on the slide, is that we're the first out of the gate in this whole idea. BC is on the leading edge of change, and the rest of the country is watching, and the rest of the country is watching with great interest because they are all looking at this model of a single nursing association and thinking it makes a great deal of sense. I've talked a bit about the coalition, and while certainly the group is collaborative and has put forward submissions around policy from a united nursing voice, there's still not a single voice because each of the associations that form that coalition are still entities in and of themselves. We've heard a lot from government and the single nurse regulator that's forming individual associations, CNA, CNPS, that they're really intrigued and really interested in seeing this come to fruition. Government in particular has said they believe and support a single nursing association. David Byers, chief nurse in the province, just released his report a couple of weeks ago, I think now, and government supports the idea of a single nursing association. The regulatory bodies, which are merging into one single regulatory body, so that would be the LPN, RPN, and CRNBC colleges, will be merging. That will happen in September of this year. That will be done by September of this year. And they too have signaled their desire, shall we say, to work with a single nursing association. And importantly, in this whole piece of the puzzle, I'd mentioned the Canadian Nurses Association watching. The Canadian Nurses Association is not only watching, but they will be bringing to their biennium and their AGM in June of this year a bylaw change that would allow for all nursing designations to be represented at the CNA table. This is historic. Michael Villeneuve, who is the CEO as of, I think it was April of last year, he's really seen the importance and the value of making the Canadian Nurses Association the Canadian Nurses Association, as opposed to the Canadian Registered Nurses, Nurse Practitioners Association. So he's really been intent on moving this forward, and it will come to a vote for them in June. I was making sure your screen's catching up there. So guiding principles. So, you know, I talked a little bit about sort of the equality piece around the BCCNA board. And when we look at the guiding principles, these were developed by the boards of the association as well as the Nurse Educator Council. And again, the boards of the associations and the associations comprise this BCCNA group. And the groups all met May of last year and talked through what would be reasonable guiding principles. And you can read them, and they are on the website as well. But number one is really the most important. And really the idea here was that each of the various designations, each of the groups, each of the associations when they met, were really clear in saying, this is important to be together. Collaboration in nursing is the way to go. Patients are served better by collaboration, but we don't want anyone to forget that each of the designations is distinct and that each comes with a legacy and a historical impact that's important to remember and respect going forward. So again, this is one of these core tenets around which this group has sort of based their entire thinking going forward into this new entity, NNPBC. So, NNPBC, Nurses and Nurse Practitioners of BC, the name. When we talk to nurses, we hear that some nurses will look at the name and say, great, it's fantastic, we recognize why this has happened. Others will look at it and say, why are nurse practitioners specifically singled out in the name? If it's a united nursing organization, why not Nurses of BC? And it's a very fair question, a very good question we get, but I can only say that this board, when wrestling with the idea of this proposed name, wrestled with it for months and months and months, months of discussion, months of looking. There are functional pieces as well when you're choosing a name. It's not just what the name is, but what website domains are available as well. So you really have to be thinking about how you can be sure to have a sort of digital presence as well as creating a name for a new entity. And really, the perspective on the name from the group ultimately landed with the fact that nurse practitioners are distinct. They do fulfill a distinct role in the system, and they are the group that has, they're around since 2005, but there are still areas in which nurse practitioners struggle to be recognized for their work. And this is a way to recognize and honor the distinctness of the role, but also some of the challenges that are present here. The group also talks around the idea when you look at something like the College of Physicians and Surgeons, surgeons are, of course, physicians. Nurse practitioners are nurses. Of course, that's true. But surgeons recognizes that it's a different type of role that a surgeon fulfills within the physician context. So this was a robust discussion. Definitely want to hear your thoughts when it comes to the question portion on this. Absolutely happy to take back thoughts and perspectives, but this was not something that was entered into lightly in terms of a naming process, and has really been something that, we talk to nurses and some will say, no, they don't like it. Others will want to think about it for a little bit and come back and ultimately say, no, you know what, it resonates with me, it makes sense. So, and really where we've gotten at this point is that most nurses are recognizing that it makes sense at this point. But again, that's not to say that we don't welcome additional feedback on this, because I'd love to hear your thoughts when we get to questions. All right, governance model. So this is just kind of this sort of a very outlining diagram about what the governance model for this new NNPBC, again, Nurses and Nurse Practitioners of BC, would look like. You can see that the professional associations, ARNBC, LPNABC, ARPNBC, and BCNPA would sort of cease to be professional associations and would become councils. And that's where you see the RN, RPN, NP, LPN council represented there. So they would cease to be boards of directors and would become councils, feeding into that overall NNPBC structure. You can see you've got 2, 2, 2, 2. So that would mean 2 representatives from the RN Council, 2 from RPN, 2 from NP, 2 from LPN, feeding into that central board of directors. We'll talk a little bit about councils a little bit more, but I just want to flag that the idea of the council is that they will manage some budget and they will be responsible for the work of their particular designation. And how they choose to bring people to that center table will be something that their terms of reference can outline for them in the future. And again, we'll talk about that a little bit more when we get to a couple of the next slides. You'll also see the Nursing Education Council represented by a single rep. Again, their choice. They're structured a bit differently. They're comprised of representatives of the schools of nursing in BC, and their structure has always been a bit different than the association. So they will come with 1 rep to the table. There will be a student representative. The way in which the student representative will work, that's still sort of being hashed out a little bit. And the idea with the student representative is that this person have a role in that students have a role in this new association, and that they be that they have a real and active role on this board, right? That they be voting members, et cetera, of course. And then you've got the public representative, which is public patient representative. And then you can see the Indigenous representative there. And what this is, this does represent a change to the way in which the councils would elect people to their particular council. So right now, the Association of Registered Nurses runs an Indigenous director seat. They're the only ones who so far do this, but this group is positing that each of the groups run an Indigenous seat for an Indigenous nurse of that particular designation, so that each council has an Indigenous nurse sitting on their particular council, and that those 4 Indigenous nurses then have a mechanism through which they are able to decide amongst themselves who the best representative to that NNPBC board is. So that's a pretty, I'd say that's a very, very significant mechanism by which the Indigenous role and the Indigenous nursing role can be respected, honored, and recognized through each of these councils and on this board in particular. Okay, so as mentioned, here's a little bit about the councils, and just want to sort of summarize a little bit about that and really sort of give you a sense of the councils kind of being the place where really the rubber can hit the road, as it were, for the specific designations. So councils will be elected by members of the designation. They will advocate for the interests of their designation. They will be the voice for that particular designation. You can see that they'll hold elections for council members in the spring. I've mentioned the Indigenous nursing representative who would be included on it. 2 of them will come to the NNPBC board. Again, you know, it may be a president-elect scenario that would be sent to the NNPBC board, but that's really for them to sort of ascertain in their terms of reference. The terms of reference for these groups are kind of out for circulation and will be posted on the website in the coming weeks for everyone to look at. The goal is as well that these councils will meet 6 to 8 times a year. They will be able to set their own meeting schedule, and they will manage a budget that will be part of the larger operating budget. And this budget, the idea is that primarily it be used for allowing these councils to come together to be able to speak about issues that are impacting the designation. That's not to say that there isn't an opportunity for additional budget to be allocated to the councils on an as-needed basis. So if one of the councils is experiencing, you know, a particularly, challenging issue, or there's something that's come up that requires special funding to be allocated, there is a mechanism by which that council can petition the NNPBC board and receive those additional funds. So this is our webpage. It's nnpbc.com. I'll flash a page up at the end. But we want to hear from you. We want to have anyone who is willing and able and desiring to do so to take the online survey. You can see it linked there. To look at the past webinars, as I'd mentioned, these are all archived. If you'd like us to come talk to you or your group, that's okay. We're really not in the business of saying no at this point. We'd love to be able to come and speak to your groups. There are a variety of materials that you can download that sort of explain this process in a nutshell. So if you'd like to have some of those materials, you can feel free to look at them. You can also always email us. Their email address is info@nnpbc.com for now on the website, and we'd be happy to send you materials as well. So we're really, as I said, about 2,000 nurses that we've consulted with, but there's more to do, and we recognize that there's more opportunity to continue to have that dialogue and that conversation with nurses. So we would welcome any and all feedback, and we will always, my commitment, I always tell people when I do these, my commitment is that what you say and the perspectives you bring, I will be sure to bring back to the board table. I will always ensure that what's happened gets back there. So with that, I will leave this on the screen, just so you've got it there. And I will open the floor for questions. I know there can be a bit of a delay on questions, so forgive the dead air as we wait for questions to pop in. And you can feel free to go ahead and type those questions, and I'll read them out as I see them come in. And we'll give everyone just a couple minutes to do that as we sort of wait for things to populate there. Okay, so there's one question in focused on the way in which the group hopes to be able to ensure that the roles of the designations are respected and honored. And it's a really good question. And again, it's something that I think as a whole, we're really focused on from a big picture perspective. So I'd mentioned the guiding principles, and the guiding principles are, well, they're the principles that guide the group, for lack of a better way to put it. So that first one I'd mentioned, that sort of ensuring that each of the uniqueness and the histories of the designations is respected, is what sort of drives and motivates this group. And then again, the councils are really where this work comes in. So each of the councils having an equal voice and an equal representation at the table, and having the ability to meet with other nurses of their respective designations on a regular basis is a really important way in which I think we can mitigate any fear or concern that one of the designations may get lost. You also have things like codes of conduct and ways in which board members interact with one another to ensure that you have that equality of voice present at the table, and that's really important to do. I hope that answered that. Okay, and another question about fees. So good question, very good question. And I wish I could provide a definitive for you on the fees issue. So we can only begin to negotiate a fee structure with the single nursing regulator when that group is an actual entity, and that will not happen until September. I will say that the commitment across the board is we recognize that fees in this province for nurses are high. There's no mistaking that. We've seen some of the feedback that's gone to the various colleges about the fee increases, and they are, it's challenging for nurses. It's a lot of fees in this province to pay, and we certainly respect that. So for this group, the commitment will be to keeping fees low. And moreover, when we look at that CNA piece, there have been many discussions with the Canadian Nurses Association about ensuring that the fees are reduced and lowered from the perspective of, if they have more members, fees can then commensurately go down as a result of it. We're also really are looking at the whole idea of shared services and shared infrastructure. So each of the professional associations will be working under a single umbrella. And that means you have shared staff, shared services, and that means costs can be lowered. So we can't say specifically on the fee question, and again, that's not to be evasive, but because those negotiations can't happen until the regulator is up and running. But the commitment from the group is in absolute honor and recognition of the fees that nurses pay at this point in time. I'll give it just another few seconds for questions to pop in. Okay, so someone's just a comment, and thank you for this. So someone's just commented that they appreciate the name and they understand why highlighting nurse practitioners in the title is a good decision to make. So thank you for that. Appreciate the feedback on that. And I'll just give it another couple of seconds. Additional questions? Bear with me. I'm just watching the pane open here just to be sure that we've got opportunity for everyone to ask questions. I know it can take a few seconds for things to populate in, even at the best internet connection speed. Okay. So I do not see any additional questions. I want to just give it another couple of beats just to be sure. And I will say as well, while I've just got this box open, giving it a few extra beats there, that, you know, if you have additional questions as time goes on, the website is always open, and we are always open for comments and questions. So info@nnpbc.com, you can see it on your screen there, and the website, www.nnpbc.com. Additionally, we have a Twitter feed and a Facebook page. So there are lots of ways in which we hope you will choose to engage and connect with us and ask us questions as you think of it. And there's really, from our perspective, no question that we won't answer. It's our opportunity to be completely honest and transparent with you as you ask these questions, and we want to make sure that we honor that across the board throughout these consultation process. Okay, so I don't see anything else coming in. So I will, with that, I think I talked really super fast, so we're at about 30 minutes or so into it. I will go ahead and end this. We've been pretty stable on our numbers, so I think we've got a good collection of people who've come in from the beginning and have stayed in, so that's good. And I will just bid farewell and thank you to each of you, and again remind you that you can send any link on the website to anyone at any time. And we thank you all very much for your time, your participation, and your thoughts around all of this. Thank you.